As a drummer, I used to play solos in the band, but there's this one special evening when the lights went off. Of course, then it wasn't called load shedding. The power went off, and I was the only one who could play acoustically. And I think I played a drum solo for more than 25 minutes, which personally I believe it was long drum solo. And but because I was very fit, I didn't feel it, and all I could hear was this applause from the audience and so on. And one of my fellow musicians, whose name is Condry, came, in a typical township part where he says, hey, fun, hi, where she, so yes, hot sticks, and that's how the name got to be. I always say to people I became a musician, professional musician by default. I never really wanted to be, I never imagined I could be a musician or even performing. Yes, I loved music because I grew up in an environment where music was ubiquitous. It was everywhere. I mean, in Shantytown where I was born, there was intertribal, interaction from different kinds of people. And so almost every Sunday one could hear music from all different genres, different styles of music, different traditional music. I guess that's had some indelible influence on how I would later in years, journey into the music industry. But how I got to become involved in the performance was at high school, where I met um, fellow students who had come from another school, Selbin Tuli, Alec Howdy, and Arthur Afapa, had given a performance at school, and they didn't have a drummer. And I introduced myself to Selby to say, listen, I'm a drummer. And by then, I wasn't really a drummer. I had only played in a cadet band, so I played a cattle drum. I took my chances there. And Selby invited me to come and join the band, and the rest was history. It was one of the, to speak about apartheid is as to find a difficult expression in how it impacted on everybody's life, in particular black people's, probably some white people as well, because they didn't understand what was happening. And they knew it, they benefited from it, but they didn't know what it was and how it affected us as a people. So, and in one of the talks I gave to a school, I spoke about that experience. For instance, coming to Cape Town, and we could not stay in hotels. We could not play in clubs designated for colored whites or Indians. So there was strictly to perform at a so-called black clubs. When we came to Cape Town, one of the places we performed was the Athlone, the club called the Web. But we always had to drive back to Guguletu to go and sleep. Even then, when we stayed in Guguletu, we were required to have a permit to stay even in a black township, because we came outside from Cape Town. We came from Johannesburg. So for us to be in a township, in another township, in another town, everything was regulated. So it was a very difficult lifestyle that apartheid, you know, uh, uh, brought upon African people. Well, I'd love to believe that we were a conscious voice in music, like those who had been before us, like Miriam Makeba, Hugh Masekela, Jonas Gwangwa, Kaifa Siminya, Letta Mbulu, and the list is endless and Abdullah Ibrahim, those musicians who believe that music plays a critical role. So we were a generation after that. And of course, musicians can only be involved in politics if if they're self-conscious of their space. And I believe the Beaters, Harare, the band which I belong to, were very conscious, especially when we started touring countries where there was a groundswell of liberation struggle. So we came from Zim, then it was known as Rhodesia, and the struggle was intensifying. So our level of consciousness obviously embraced that, and we made our music in accordance with how we could advance the struggle through our music. And yes, true, I always believe that jazz, and in particular, is revolutionary music, is a music of expression, how one feels. Maybe it may not necessarily be lyrically, but lyrically through the instrument in which it expresses itself. It was indicative of how people wanted the freedom, and jazz became that revolutionary sound, which we as young people also embraced. I don't know if one is able to apply geopolitics into jazz, you know, because jazz is interactive. And I've always believed some of the musicians from Cape Town who came up to Johannesburg, they found that the musicians in Johannesburg were as well as accommodating and embracing. I mean, Winston came to Johannesburg to record Yakali Nkomo with Eli Mabuza. He played with all those musicians. I mean, Abdullah Ibrahim came to Johannesburg where they formed the Jazz Epistles along Hugh Masekela, Kipo Moketsi, and so on, and vice versa. So I don't know if there was a specific sound that could be identified as Cape Jazz, even though there were more musicians who came out of Cape Town. And Cape Jazz perhaps needs to be described in a way that relate to a particular sound. I wouldn't know if I would be the right person to speak about it, but you got musicians like Robbie Jansen, you know, again, a very conscientious musician. Basil Manenberg. Basil was one of those musicians as well. Mervyn Africa, and Melvin Matthews. All those musicians were incredible musicians. I don't know if when they played jazz, the intention of the objective was to promote Cape Jazz. It was jazz across, the continent. I don't want to speak. I don't want to speak about having been a jazz musician. I I honestly never ever considered myself a truly jazz musician. I listen to jazz greatly, but I also listen to great jazz. And maybe and by that interaction with the music, I find ways in which I can express some of my music through jazz. And um, the the music that I play in other sources or other voices wouldn't be considered jazz, even though I intersperse some of it with jazz. I don't know. People speak about you're a saxophonist, you play jazz. Am I a jazz musician? I don't know. I still have to find out. But I've had great highlights. I mean, some of those were playing with I've been fortunate to have played with almost all South African musicians of all kinds. The only musician I'm still hoping one day he would invite me to play with is Abdullah Ibrahim, but I've played with all of them. Maybe those were the highlights of my playing music with some of the greatest jazz musicians. I played with Zim, I played with Begi Mselegu, I played with Kaya Mahlangu, I played with Winston, I played with Robbie. So how fortunate, how can fortunate be one be, you know? How really can I consider it kind of privilege? I think I was probably privileged. Maybe also because I ran a jazz club. And having run a jazz club, it gave me the opportunity to interact with many of those musicians. I know, being a musician is a very difficult life. We love music, and I think in turn it loves us, but at the same time, it also divorces us from those people that we consider very close to us. I haven't spent as much time as I really would have hoped and wished for with all my children, and but fortunately, the relationship that I've had with them is such that they themselves now consider themselves becoming musicians, and they probably understand maybe why I was not really there all the time as I would have wanted to, because I was always traveling, I was away, and some of them grew up overseas. But hey, I'm blessed to have children that I still relate to very strongly. I was in a hair salon. We never imagined that I was in a hair salon and I was watching TV, and the clerk made the announcement. The euphoria. I was euphoric. I jumped out and I said, I'm not cutting my hair. I went into my car, and all you could hear was ululating, whistling, and people were hooting their cars. It was almost the country has overturned. Something new has just happened that nobody actually expected. I mean, the euphoria was just overwhelming. I was in Soweto. Soweto everywhere was just in an amazed. People were crying. People were crying. People were. Phew. It's very difficult for someone to understand. I'm sure it happened all over the world, all over the country, when that announcement was made. I cried. I was in those lines immediately after I had voted. I was in tears. And I was fortunate to have voted exactly the same place where Bishop Tutu voted. And we both of us, and he came out of there and he raised his fist and he made, and he said, we are free at last. We are free at last. All I could do was look at all the people who were there. Some of them were older, and some of them were saying, now I can sleep. And all I could do was just, my tears just broke. I just broke down. I think it's very important for us to say we owe we owe it to ourselves, especially as musicians, to have been part of advancing a struggle of freedom, of being able to do things how we felt, things that we felt were important to our society, and being able to interact with all people. I mean, the greatest thing to be able to celebrate is seeing audiences, black and white people in the same room, appreciating the music, the stun, the the jazz. The Cape Town International Jazz Festival was one of those great experiences. And for me, I always take my hat off for Rashid. But Rashid also must be understood that he was a revolutionary himself. This is why he felt as a photographer, as a jazz photographer, he captured moments which were very special. And for him to bring International Jazz Festival to South Africa for the first time, that was a milestone that should always be considered as contributing to the psyche of the South African people. Uh, enough, but not enough. You know, I think the biggest challenge we have in this country is whether people understand the value of the arts. Until such time that people in politics understand the value of the arts would always remain the stepchild of politics, because it's people who do not appreciate the importance. You know, I once read in a book called A Meaning of Things. What are those things? It says the arts has got to be celebrated alongside the science and mathematics and all other subjects. Science, mathematics, and the arts and all other subjects. Counting the three, it says the arts are at another level. I mean, I met this professor who introduced himself to me, and he said, Sipho, there's something I've always marveled about music. You know, we as artists, as scientists, we always have reference, and our reference is always the research that has been done by others. But what we have always found fascinating is how you guys naturally create something that we respond to, you know, emotionally and so on, and physically. Physically means dancing to things that we create. In other words, your level of intellect as artists is way high above the same things that we consider the highest level of intellect, which is arts and mathematics. It's so difficult to explain how it felt to be next to that man. I was privileged. I come from Orlando West, where he stayed, where he lived, where he left, you know. My parents were members of the African National Congress, so there were meetings held at my home at some stage. But when he came out of prison and I was invited to go and meet him at the house, that was magical. That was magical. You know, you stand in front of that man, you never know how to respond. And for us to perform for him and how he expressed what music did for them when they were in prison was um, inexplicable. It's inexplicable. You cannot just find words to describe the feeling. You know, that here's a man who stayed so many years in prison alongside you know, Babu Sisulu, Gavin Begi, and all of them. They stayed in all prisons, and when you came out to perform for them, their response and reaction was just that of love, outpouring love and respect for what we were doing. That was special. You know, if truth be told, there's a lot of disappointment. The level of conscience from those who had been there before is completely different from those who are there now, in that we all understood what was the purpose of liberation. The purpose of liberation was that everybody would live equally, and we would fight against poverty, would fight against homelessness, would fight for good education. But sadly, those who now hold the reins of power, those are not the things that they probably consider. People go into politics for self-serving. Most of the people who go in there, it's more about power. It's about how they can benefit from there. As to whether the role is to benefit the majority of the people is critical. And one of the saddest things about this country is the corruption. The corruption that has eaten away from society. The character of the people who are in there, who don't even realize that with corruption, self-preservation, you're destroying a people, you're destroying a generation, a future of the people, because when they come to be, there will be nothing left for them to aspire to, because we as a generation have allowed corruption to take away our integrity and dignity as a people. Life must be lived purposefully. We are not the arbiters of what should happen in life. I think everything I've done has been through guidance of my ancestral and God's guidance to what is it that I'm going to be doing as a human being. I think as long as my energy carries me beyond where I am, there's more to life that I want to contribute to. Not only through music, but also engaging with people. I mean, we need to live our lives purposefully, give off ourselves to what we have gained from others, and pass on the baton to the younger people.